Good morning. Thank you to Professor Kim and the Presidential Commission on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth for inviting me to this important conference. You have a great opportunity, your commission, to inspire action not only in Korea but also globally. I'm going to share a few thoughts briefly on communicating the risk, opportunity and agency of climate change. First, the risk. If we're going to act effectively on this great challenge of climate change, then it's important that we understand exactly how big a problem it is. A difficulty we have at present is much of the information on climate change is communicated by scientists in the form of prediction. Prediction tells you first what is most likely to happen, and then it asks, second, what effect might that have on things that we care about? But risk assessment is very different. When we deal with issues like nuclear proliferation or pandemics, then we ask first, what's the worst that could happen? And then, how likely is that? And this gives us very different answers. For example, with respect to the rise in global sea levels, often we're told that the most likely outcome this century is around 0.5 meter to 1 meter, but it's not clear why we should worry about that. Whereas if we ask what's the worst that could happen, well, one way of asking that question is what level of sea level rise would be impossible for a city to defend against. There's a study that asked that question for London, and it found that for 1 meter, we could extend the Thames barrier that protects London from flooding. For 3 meters, we could build a new barrier further out to sea, a larger one. But when we get to 5 meters of global sea level rise, it becomes more or less impossible to protect the City of London, and we would have to move to a different capital. And that leads us then to ask, well, how likely is that? When could that occur? And we find, in fact, the long-term committed sea level rise for global warming of just 2 degrees C is actually about 10 meters, double what London might be able to protect itself against. And there's very high uncertainty about when these kind of extreme sea level rise heights could be reached. But in the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it found that in a worst case scenario, 5 meters could be reached by the year 2150. So London has a history of 2000 years, but its future could be only 200 years, unless we're able to avoid this risk. A second example is heat stress. Very often we see predictions of lost labor productivity due to increasing heat stress. But we can ask, what's the worst that could happen? And in fact, then we find there is a limit of human tolerance to heat stress, where the conditions are so hot and humid that your body can't lose heat anymore by sweating, which means that even if you are young and healthy, lying down, resting in the shade, tipping water over yourself to keep cool, you would still die of heat stress. And in the current climate, that does not happen, but in the future, it could in fact become very likely in parts of the world where hundreds of millions of people live. So this kind of communication of risk is extremely important as we think about how to protect the people and the places that we love. Second, to talk about opportunity. It used to be thought that decarbonizing the economy would only be a cost, and the more we try to reduce emissions, the more it would cost. But this is a very outdated understanding. The new understanding is that in fact there is opportunity here, that the move to a zero emission economy will save us large amounts of money. According to one estimate by Oxford University, it can save $12 trillion globally by 2050. So we're moving to a better system than the one we came from. And the transition does not just get more and more difficult. In fact, there's a tipping point. And once we get past that tipping point, then the transition will become faster and easier. But how do we access those opportunities? Well, we have to understand the economy in the right way. We have to understand that the economy is not a machine, it's an ecosystem. It's not static and predictable. If we think it's a machine, then the job of government is really just to fix it when it fails and otherwise do nothing. But if we understand it's an ecosystem that is constantly changing, evolving, growing, then we realize that the role of government is to guide its growth in a desired direction, a direction that's good for society. And in fact, this is just like South Korea's experience in the past, when your country went from being one of the poorest in the world to being successful in agriculture, in industry, in computing and electronics, and becoming ranked as the most innovative country in the world for 6 years running. South Korea is a world champion of industrial strategy, and that is exactly the kind of knowledge that needs to be brought to the clean transition that we face now, the transition to a clean economy. One important thing when we look at technology transitions of the past is the actions that led to them happening and that made them happen faster were overwhelmingly to do with creating the new system. When we moved from horses to cars, it happened because people invested in motors, they invested in factories, they innovated, they built the highways, they wrote the highway code, they created these new systems. That was what made this transition happen, and happen quickly. It wasn't because they all just put a tax on horse manure, even though that was a problem in the large cities like London. So it's just the same as we move to a clean economy. It will not be enough just to put a tax on carbon, on pollution. We have to overwhelmingly focus on investing in the new. And when we do that, we find that progress is much faster than we expected. The total deployment of solar power globally in 2020 was more than 10 times as much as governments aimed for in their targets and as experts expected. And that was because of these reinforcing feedbacks. Increasing demand drives investment. Investment drives innovation. Innovation leads to improvement, and improvement leads to more demand. And a really important thing here is to recognize that everybody has a role in making this happen. People at each point of the economy can help to accelerate change. And that brings me on to the third thing I want to talk about, which is agency. What can we each do about this problem? Well, often we're told that we should eliminate our carbon footprint, and that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing if you can reduce your carbon footprint, eliminate it, but it's not enough. And in fact, it risks being a distraction. This idea was even promoted by an oil company. And one of the reasons it may have done that is it distracts us from what really matters, which is system change. So I think it's more important for us each to think about what is our point of leverage? What can you do better than most can do to bring about system change? And you can think about this at every level. What can you as an individual do to change your organization? What can your organization do to change your society or to change your national economy? And what can you do as a country that helps change the world? In terms of how we communicate these stories of what we need to do, I think the story of solving climate change is much less like an American film where you have one character, one hero who saves the world. And it's actually much more like a Korean film, in particular this one I've seen, which I think is an incredible description of how system change works, where you have each of these characters, a student, a prosecutor, a prison guard, a journalist, each of them doing what they can do from their point in the system, and they enable somebody else to do something more, and eventually the outcome of their collective actions is change at the level of the system. That's how it happened when we look at technology transitions of the past. For example, the transition from cesspools to sewers. It was driven by engineers who invented pipelines, doctors who understood the link between dirty water and disease, entrepreneurs who created the first water companies, and city governments and their national governments who built the infrastructure and extended it to cover all of the population. Again, this is what we see in low carbon transitions. The UK has had the fastest power sector decarbonisation in the world, and this has been brought about by citizens who campaigned for carbon budgets, academics who helped design policies, businesses, including offshore engineers who came across from the oil and gas industry and helped build the new offshore wind infrastructure. And all of this together helped cross a tipping point where coal became the most expensive form of power generation, tipped from being profitable to being loss-making, and was rapidly kicked out of our energy system. Meanwhile, renewable power was growing extremely fast. And of course, sometimes we may be making the mistake in the UK of thinking about that as just a national achievement, but in fact, it's part of a global achievement. Wind power became cheap in many ways thanks to Denmark. And when we look at solar power, we see many countries made a contribution, from the early US scientists who put solar panels on a satellite, through the US government and the Japanese government subsidizing early deployment, then the green activists and campaigners in Germany, the Green Party, pushed for policies to create the largest markets for solar power at that time, and then the Chinese business people, and often overlooked the Australian professors who taught those Chinese business people, who then went on and created the largest solar power manufacturing companies in the world. All of these countries together brought us from a situation where solar power was a space technology to what the IEA now calls it the cheapest form of electricity generation in history. Now, when we as the UK hosted the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26, in 2021, I think the most important outcome was something called the Breakthrough Agenda, where countries covering nearly 3/4 of the global economy agreed that they would work together to cross the tipping points where clean technologies become the most affordable, accessible, and attractive option in each of the emitting sectors. That's a very inspiring goal, and it's something that every country can contribute to. It's not just about reducing your own emissions, it's thinking, what is your point of leverage to help move the global economy to a zero-emission, clean economy? And as you think about this, you will know your own country better than anybody else does. You are the best judges of where your point of leverage is. And in fact, there may be very many, but I want to suggest just one, if I can. When we held COP26 in Glasgow, it was on the banks of the River Clyde, where it was once the centre of the world's shipbuilding industry. And that crane you see in the middle of the picture, it used to lift up coal-powered trains and put them onto coal-powered ships to export them around the world in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. But now, the centre of the world's shipbuilding industry has moved to your country, and the largest shipbuilding place in the world is this Hyundai shipyard in Ulsan. Now, clearly, Korea has a chance to lead the transition to zero-emission shipping globally, and there are already initiatives beginning to create the first green shipping corridors, where the first zero-emission ships will be placed in the water and will start to move on these long-distance international routes. Now, that's incredibly important, but it's not only about reducing emissions from shipping. When a few days ago I was talking to world experts in the offshore wind industry, and they were telling me the growth of offshore wind globally is being held back because there are not enough of the big ships that help go out and install the offshore wind turbines. At the same time, I'm hearing that electricity interconnectors that join the grids of different countries together and help them balance supply and demand, those are being held back because there are not enough large ships to deploy the cables. So there's a huge need here to quickly manufacture more of these large ships that will not only change shipping itself, but also accelerate the global transition to steel power, to clean power. And one more thing, of course, those ships are built of large amounts of steel, and if you decide that you will only use clean steel in those ships, then that will also help accelerate the transition to zero-emission steel globally. So this sector represents a huge point of leverage over global decarbonization, and it may be one that your country is positioned to activate better than anybody else can. So to conclude, Korea, we need you. We thank you for everything you're doing, and I wish you all the best in this conference and in the important work of your Commission on Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth. Thank you.